In the quiet town of Willowbrook, where whispers traveled faster than the wind, Eleanor Green's murder shook the community to its core. Eleanor, known for her grace and social charms, had recently been found dead under mysterious circumstances in her secluded lakefront cottage. As detectives pieced together the fragments of her life, a web of deceit and forbidden passions unraveled. Eleanor had been married to Charles Green, a man respected in the community for his unblemished reputation as a local businessman. Their marriage seemed picture-perfect on the surface, but Eleanor had been drifting away from Charles, drawn instead to the allure of another man, Raymond Caldwell. Raymond was not just anyone. He was the husband of Eleanor's cousin, Irene. Their affair was a dangerous game, and Eleanor knew that indulging in it could destroy her life and tear apart her family. But her passion for Raymond was like a fire that wouldn't die out. Raymond, a ruggedly handsome man with a magnetic charm, found himself ensnared by Eleanor's beauty and mystery. He'd been married to Irene for years, yet something about Eleanor made him forget his commitments. Their encounters, stolen moments of passion, fueled by secrecy, quickly escalated beyond their control. Yet, this wasn't a romance that could hide in the shadows forever. Rumors had already started bubbling under the surface, whispers that reached the wrong ears, including those of Eleanor's husband, Charles, and Irene herself. Charles, who had always kept his suspicions under wraps, could no longer ignore the uneasy feeling in his gut. His late nights filled with questioning himself and sleepless hours of wondering if his wife was truly in love with someone else finally bore down on him. The once gentle and composed man found his resentment growing with each passing day. As for Irene, Eleanor's cousin and the scorned wife, the realization of betrayal cut deep. Irene had admired Eleanor her entire life, almost to the point of envy, always feeling she had to measure up to her. To know her husband, Raymond, had chosen Eleanor over her was a wound that quickly turned into rage. One cold November night, as fog rolled over the lake and shrouded Willowbrook in a haunting mist, Eleanor had arranged a final meeting with Raymond at her cottage. Their affair had reached a breaking point, and they both knew it. They argued about their future, about what they were willing to risk to keep seeing each other. But Eleanor wanted more. She demanded that Raymond leave Irene, that he give her some proof of commitment. Raymond hesitated, torn between his desire and his crumbling marriage, the consequences weighing heavily on him. The night wore on, tension hanging in the air, as thick as the fog outside. But Eleanor and Raymond were not alone. Unbeknownst to them, both Charles and Irene had been pushed to the brink, each privately deciding that they could not stand by any longer. Charles had followed Eleanor that night, his mind clouded with anger and a need for answers, and Irene, too, had come to confront the woman who had betrayed her trust. When they arrived, they found Raymond and Eleanor locked in a passionate argument by the fireside. A confrontation erupted. Words turned to accusations, and accusations turned to threats. Charles and Irene's pain, betrayal, and fury poured out like a torrent, drowning any remaining traces of love or family loyalty. The cottage was a battleground of broken promises, wounded egos, and shattered hearts. Then, in the heat of the moment, the unthinkable happened. It was never clear exactly who had struck the first blow. Perhaps it was Charles, with years of restrained rage finally unleashed. Or maybe Irene, her heartbreak twisted into blinding fury. By the time dawn broke, Eleanor lay lifeless on the floor, her once vibrant features pale and still. The man who had been torn between two women now stood shocked and horrified, while the cousin who had once idolized Eleanor gazed down at her with tear-streaked cheeks and blood on her hands. The investigation into Eleanor's death quickly pointed to the love quadrangle, as the residents of Willowbrook clung to their own theories, filling in gaps with speculation. The detectives could tell that Eleanor's death had not been premeditated, but rather the tragic outcome of love gone wrong. Yet the precise details of that fatal moment remained, shrouded in silence, as each person present chose to tell their own story, a story riddled with half-truths, omissions, and desperate attempts to preserve their own innocence. In the end, the courts heard testimonies laden with remorse and accusation, a portrait of human frailty painted in shades of grief, jealousy, and revenge. Raymond, Charles, and Irene would forever carry the weight of that night, haunted by the truth they refused to fully confess, and the ghost of Eleanor Green, whose love and betrayal had left them forever changed. Willowbrook moved on, but those involved could not. For them, the fog over the lake was a constant reminder of the darkness that had taken root in their lives, a darkness that even justice could not dispel. Months passed, and the small town of Willowbrook was left with whispers and shadows. Though the trial had concluded and the sentence had been handed down, Charles and Irene received prison terms for manslaughter, while Raymond was released but forever tainted by his association with the crime. The mystery surrounding Eleanor's death lingered like a fog over the lake. It was as though the town itself resisted forgetting, preserving the unanswered questions and the tragic, sordid details in the minds of all who knew her. Raymond had returned to his house on the outskirts of town, but he was a changed man. The once confident charmer now drifted through his days as a shell of himself, racked by guilt and regret. His nights were plagued by nightmares in which Eleanor's face loomed out of the darkness, her eyes accusing, her voice whispering fragments of that final argument. He couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor's death was somehow his fault, even if he hadn't dealt the fatal blow. The weight of her love and her loss gnawed at him, a burden he carried alone. Despite the passage of time, Raymond found himself drawn back to the lake, to the site of the tragedy. He would stand on the edge of the water, watching as ripples distorted his reflection, as if the lake itself was trying to show him something he had missed. Sometimes he swore he heard her laughter in the wind, or caught glimpses of her silhouette in the mist. The lake had become his sanctuary and his prison, a place that held the fragments of a life he could never reclaim. Meanwhile, Charles languished in prison, his anger replaced by an empty hollowness. During the trial, he had maintained a quiet dignity, admitting to his role, but refusing to explain why he'd acted as he did. Only he knew the true extent of his rage, the years of feeling inadequate, of suspecting that Eleanor's love was elsewhere. To the outside world, he appeared stoic, almost indifferent. But in the solitary moments of his cell, Charles was haunted by visions of that night. The firelight casting long shadows, Eleanor's pleading face, and the realization that in trying to confront her betrayal, he'd lost the one person he had ever truly loved. Irene, too, was lost to grief. In prison, her heartbreak had morphed into something darker, an unyielding anger that fed on her isolation. She no longer wept for Eleanor, nor for Raymond, whose memory she had buried deep within her, a wound she would never allow to heal. Instead, she focused on survival, on shielding herself from the judgment of the world outside. She spent her days retracing her cousin's betrayals, reliving every slight, every small humiliation she'd endured. She no longer questioned why she'd gone to that cottage that night. She only questioned why she hadn't acted sooner, before Eleanor had ruined her life. One autumn evening, exactly a year after Eleanor's death, Raymond visited the lake once more, desperate for answers, or perhaps simply for closure. The night was eerily similar to the one that had changed everything. Mist hung low over the water, and a bone-chilling wind swept through the trees, carrying whispers that seemed to echo Eleanor's name. As he walked along the shore, Raymond noticed something strange, a faint light flickering from Eleanor's old cottage. Though the cottage had been abandoned since her death, its windows now glowed with an otherworldly luminescence, casting pale beams over the lake's dark surface. Driven by a mixture of fear and curiosity, Raymond approached the cottage, his heart pounding as he stepped onto the creaking porch. The door, strangely, was unlocked, and as he stepped inside, he was met with a peculiar sight. The living room was exactly as it had been that night, untouched and preserved in a haunting tableau. Dust covered the furniture, but the fire still seemed to crackle in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the room. And there, standing by the window, was a figure, her silhouette unmistakable. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure turned, her face pale, her eyes filled with a sorrow that pierced him to his core. Raymond felt a shiver run down his spine, but he couldn't look away. She appeared as he remembered her, but somehow older, worn by the tragedy she had endured. "Why did you come back?" Her voice was soft, almost mournful, as if she too were trapped between worlds, unable to move on. Raymond tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He wanted to apologize, to explain, to tell her he had never meant for things to end this way. But the weight of his guilt held him silent, his shame woven into the stillness of the room. Eleanor's gaze softened, as if she could see the remorse etched in his face. She drifted toward him, and for a moment, he thought she might touch his hand, forgive him, release him from the torment he carried. But as she reached out, her expression changed, darkened with a sudden unspoken revelation. "You never knew, did you?" she murmured, a hint of bitterness coloring her tone. Raymond frowned, confusion mingling with fear. "What do you mean?" Her face was etched with sorrow and anger as she whispered, "You were just another part of it, a pawn in her game. She didn't love you, Raymond. She only wanted to hurt him and me. She wanted to watch us all suffer." The realization struck him like a blow. Had he been so blinded by desire, so wrapped up in his own fantasies, that he'd missed the true nature of Eleanor's intentions? The bitterness in her voice, the fury in her eyes, revealed a side of Eleanor he had never known, a woman driven not by love, but by vengeance. Before he could ask more, the figure began to fade, her form dissolving into the flickering light, leaving him alone in the silence of the cottage. The fire died, the mist closed in, and Raymond was left standing in the dark, haunted by the knowledge that he too had been used, a pawn in a tragic game he barely understood. As he left the cottage and stepped into the cold night, Raymond realized that he would never escape Eleanor's memory. She was gone, but her spirit lingered, binding him to the lake, to the tragedy, and to a love that had never truly existed. For the rest of his days, he would wander, a lost soul searching for forgiveness that would never come, forever bound to the ghost of Eleanor Green. Raymond's encounter with Eleanor's apparition left him haunted in ways he hadn't thought possible. He withdrew from life in Willowbrook, selling his house and cutting ties with everyone who had known him. His days passed in a fog, much like the mist that cloaked the lake on the night of her death. Driven by his newfound understanding of Eleanor's betrayal, of his own role as a pawn, Raymond fled from his past, but he could never truly leave it behind. The strange events in the cottage had left him questioning everything he thought he knew about Eleanor. Was she truly the bitter woman she'd revealed in those final moments? Or was his mind, fractured by grief and regret, conjuring these visions as a way of punishing him further? With no answers to his questions, Raymond took to wandering, drifting from town to town, haunted by memories that shadowed him like a curse. He became a ghost himself, a man who no longer lived but merely existed, and he knew he could never return to Willowbrook. He was doomed to carry the weight of Eleanor's death, the revelation of her deception, and the emptiness that filled his heart where his love had once been. Then, one cold winter evening in a nameless town, Raymond encountered a strange woman while nursing a drink in a dimly lit bar. She was older, with dark, penetrating eyes and a calm, watchful demeanor. Something about her presence was unsettling, almost otherworldly, as though she saw more than what was in front of her. She had watched him for some time before finally sitting next to him. "You're lost," she said simply, her voice low and steady. Raymond looked at her, surprised and a bit unnerved. He felt as though she could see right through him, through his guilt, his regret, his sorrow. He tried to laugh it off, but the woman didn't smile. "You're haunted by a woman," she continued, her eyes dark and piercing. "Someone who used you, twisted you, and left you broken. She won't let you go, and you won't let yourself go either." He stared at her, heart pounding. How could she possibly know? But before he could speak, she placed a small, smooth stone on the bar in front of him. It was a deep black, with a strange, shimmering quality, like a pool of midnight water. "This will help you see the truth," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the bar. "But only if you're willing to face it." Raymond felt an odd compulsion to pick up the stone. As his fingers closed around it, he felt a strange warmth radiating through his hand, calming yet intense. He closed his eyes, and for a fleeting moment, images flashed through his mind, fragments of memories, pieces of his life with Eleanor, but now tinged with an unfamiliar clarity. In those brief glimpses, Raymond saw things he had overlooked, things he'd ignored. He remembered how Eleanor had smiled, not with love but with calculation, the way she'd spoken of her family, not with affection, but with disdain. And in a flash, he understood that she'd orchestrated everything. Every affair, every argument, every encounter had been a means to an end, a game to her. The stone's warmth intensified, and he felt himself slipping deeper, as if falling into a memory, reliving those final moments in the cottage. He saw himself there, the arguments, the accusations, and then, just as the memory reached its fevered pitch, Eleanor's gaze had shifted, almost imperceptibly, to her husband Charles. She had wanted him to be there, to see, to feel her betrayal as if it were a blade through his heart. Raymond staggered, nearly dropping the stone as the realization struck him. Eleanor's death had not been an accident, nor was it an impulsive act of passion. She had orchestrated her own destruction, knowing that her tangled web of affairs and betrayals would eventually drive someone, anyone, to a breaking point. She had wanted it to end this way, with Charles's life ruined, with Irene broken, and with Raymond forever haunted. The stranger watched him silently, her dark eyes filled with understanding, as he sat there, trembling. The truth was unbearable, yet somehow liberating. Eleanor's vengeance had never been about love or betrayal. It had been her final act, a twisted masterpiece, her way of leaving an indelible mark on the people she'd scorned. She wanted to be a legend, Raymond muttered, the weight of it all crashing over him. She didn't care about me, about any of us. We were just pieces in her game. The woman nodded, her face impassive. Some spirits linger because of love or loss, she said softly. But she lingers because of unfinished business. Until you can let go of her, she'll never be free, and neither will you. The stranger rose and left, disappearing into the shadows as mysteriously as she'd arrived. Raymond sat in the empty bar, the stone in his hand, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over him. He understood now that he had been used, but he also understood that he had the power to release himself from Eleanor's grip. Raymond returned to Willowbrook one final time, visiting the lake under the cover of night. He walked to the water's edge, where the reflection of the moon glistened across the dark surface, mirroring the memories he had carried for so long. Slowly, he let the stone slip from his hand, watching as it sank into the depths, disappearing beneath the cold, still water. As the ripples faded, so did the hold Eleanor had over him. Raymond stood there for a moment longer, breathing in the cold night air, feeling the weight of her memory lift. For the first time in years, he felt something close to peace, a quiet, calm emptiness, where once there had been grief and regret. He left Willowbrook for good, a man freed from his ghosts. The town would remember Eleanor, but he would not. For Raymond, the haunting had ended, and with it, the curse of Eleanor Green. And as the years passed, the lake remained still, its waters quiet, its secrets buried, the final resting place of a woman who had lived and died on her own terms. Willowbrook would speak of her as a mystery, a cautionary tale, a name that lingered in whispers. But for those who knew the truth, Eleanor Green was a legend. Years passed, and Eleanor Green's legend became a tale told in low voices around Willowbrook. Children grew up hearing about the beautiful, enigmatic woman whose love had turned deadly, about the passions and betrayals that led to her death on a dark autumn night. For the townspeople, Eleanor's story had become a myth, one of those ghostly yarns shared to thrill and frighten. But for those closest to her, she remained a wound that never healed. Raymond vanished from Willowbrook, leaving behind no trace or hint of where he might have gone. Some said he'd left the country. Others claimed they'd seen him living quietly on the outskirts of a distant city, an aging recluse with haunted eyes. But none who spoke of him knew for sure. Only the lake, still and dark, remembered his last visit, his final act of letting go as he cast Eleanor's memory and the cursed stone into its depths. As for Charles and Irene, their paths crossed one last time upon their release from prison, years after that fateful night. Charles, gray and worn, had lost everything, his business, his home, his reputation. But prison had forced a kind of acceptance upon him, a dull peace that allowed him to exist, albeit without purpose. Irene, on the other hand, emerged as a shadow of her former self, bitterness etched into her every feature. She had spent her years behind bars, replaying the night in her mind, the betrayal, the anger, the tragedy, and, at last, her own role in it. She had entered prison blaming Eleanor, but she left blaming herself, haunted by the anger that had consumed her. Their meeting was unplanned.